Okay. So, well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I was lucky. When I first came to study at University of Florida, after my training in social sciences in Peru, I found an amazing and motivating community of professors and students that were concerned with environment from an interdisciplinary perspective. This was especially very new in the 1980s. I remember receiving Dr. Marianne Schmink's call, and she said to me, you have been accepted, you're coming to Florida, and you have an assistantship in conservation with John Robinson. And I thought, conservation? I'm not conservative, Marianne. I panicked. I said, Marianne, what's conservation? And she laughed and said, well, it's like development, but without harming nature. And I said, yeah, that makes sense to me. I'm coming. So anyway, in reality, my journey in this field of development and conservation started when I first worked with the Ashaninka in Satipo in the central Peruvian Amazon. Although my family was from Cajamarca in the highlands of Peru, and I grew up in Lima, I was somewhat detached from nature. The Ashaninka made fun of me because I could not distinguish an all agricultural plot from a natural forest. I felt really hungry for the first time when I lived with the Ashaninka. Every day we woke up and planned the day around the procurement of food. It was working in the agricultural fields or planning hunting, fishing, or gathering trips. I realized why it was so important for the Ashaninka to secure their access to natural resources. I began to wonder, how much can they take from nature without depleting it? The older Ashaninka complained that they had to travel farther and farther to hunt peccaries. And monkeys, they were all gone. Not just from possible overhunting, but also because of the destruction of their habitat by new colonists from the highlands of Peru, probably from Cajamarca, that established monocultures around their native communities. It was, and it is key to secure land tenure for their survival. Since then until now, indigenous and local people in the Amazon have achieved the tithing of indigenous territories. But it has not been easy. Many times it has come at a high price because the pressures are huge. I am thankful that I first learned about development in the Amazon through the eyes of the Ashaninka friends, from my Ashaninka friends in Satipo. To me, it became clear that the concept of development was very relative. Development for whom? An Ashaninka, a colonist, or the owner of the neighboring cattle ranch? It's very different. Indigenous and local traditional people who live in the forest have the deepest sense of connection to nature because they depend on it, economically, socially, and spiritually. Grassroots conservation has been successful, but also it has been at the expense of tragic consequences. From Chico Mendes to establish extractive reserves in Acre in Brazil in 1988, to Edwin Chota, a Ashaninka from Peru, that was killed with other fellow Ashaninka defending their territory from illegal loggers last year. Establishing collective rights over large areas of the Amazon is still a struggle. We need to complement these grassroots approaches to achieve long-term success. In the late 80s, when I was here, we were worried that there were too many people in the planet already. I remember we were worried that we had hit the 4 billion people mark. Now we're here in 2015, and there are 7 billion people in the world. And we have a projection of, in 2050, that there might be 9 billion people in the world. That is a lot of people putting pressure over resources. Everyone needs to be fed. And because more people will be coming out of poverty, they will be demanding more protein-rich food. We only have one planet. We have tried many approaches to conserve nature, particularly place-based approaches, establishing protected areas. But the threats keep mounting. Agriculture has become the largest driver of land use change that affects climate patterns, biodiversity, water availability, and soil quality, to name just a few impacts. It will be important to be ready to feed all 9 billion people, but without destroying any more natural habitat. Currently, 70% of tropical forest destruction is caused by the expansion of agriculture. We need to use bold approaches that go beyond place-based conservation if we want to feed the world with the current land available and without further conversion of natural land. Today, I'd like to speak about 3 things. First, the limits and possibilities of protected areas for conservation. Second, market-based approaches that can effectively complement protected area conservation and help remove the pressure on natural ecosystems. And third, I want to talk about new and necessary alliances to achieve conservation in the context of globalization and economies of scale. Alliances with corporations may have a strong leverage as they have great influence over pricing, policy, and have a large impact on the planet, far more than we realize. Corporations are not usual allies, but they must be. South America is one of the last development frontiers in the world. And within South America, tropical forests are the most vulnerable ecosystems. Boundaries on the ground are necessary to establish indigenous territories and to establish protected areas. We like to establish boundaries. Good fences make good neighbors. Without a doubt, protected areas and indigenous territories are necessary for conservation. But we have to be careful not to overprotect what we care about. We need to integrate protected areas into regional and world economies so that we do not end up with islands surrounded by destruction. Over the last 20-some years, we had great opportunities to create new protected areas. Since the 90s, through our work, we demonstrated that participatory approaches for conservation are effective. For example, in Madre de Dios in Peru, we were able to establish new protected areas with the participation of indigenous peoples, farmers, local enterprises, civil society, and the government. A partnership with the University of Florida and other organizations helped internalize conservation into development plans through the MERGE program, for example. And yes, here's our very own John Dane, with a little bit more hair, yes, but it's the same one. But early on, we knew in Latin America that protected areas had to be valued by local populations in order to last for many generations into the future. The process of establishing indigenous territories across the Amazon has been uneven. In most countries, indigenous lands are under the Ministries of Culture of Development or Culture or of Development. In some countries, like Brazil and Colombia, it has been possible to establish large indigenous units, whereas in places like Peru and Ecuador, indigenous territories have been defined within more constrained boundaries. The debate over individual property versus collective property rights has been contentious, and in countries like Peru, it has not been resolved because of the tension of deciding the final use of particular pieces of land. Is the land going to be allocated for mining development, or for oil development, or for agricultural development? There are overlapping uses of resources. At any rate, indigenous lands are important pieces, not just for indigenous peoples themselves, but also for the integrity of the Amazon region. The Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation was established in 2001 and identified the conservation of the Amazon as a high priority. There were many protected areas in the Amazon already, but a lot of them were so-called paper parks. The objective was to have effective management of those paper parks and establish new ones where possible. At that time, there were about 104 million hectares under protection. Thanks to the work of many partners, such as the Field Museum, the Wildlife Conservation Society, World Wildlife Fund, and many other national NGOs across the Amazon with government agencies, and particularly through the ARPA program in Brazil, many more areas have been designated as conservation units. So all the purple areas that you see in this map were added by 2012. Roughly 80 million more hectares were added by this date. Of these, in total, the Foundation has supported the creation and effective management of about 150 million hectares. That is more or less the size of 9 states of Florida. Certainly a great accomplishment for the conservation community. The Instituto Socioambiental, ISA, with Reisgy, put together this beautiful map that you see here. And what we see here is that by 2014, nearly 50% of the Amazon is under some sort of protection, either with indigenous lands or protected areas. Considering that about 18% of the original forest cover in the Amazon is already gone, what we really need to worry about is, first, to consolidate the protection of these 50%, and second, remove the deforestation pressures in about 30% of the Amazon that is under private property or does not have a clear designation yet. We cannot say mission accomplished, not yet. The pressures on the Amazon are still real, and the objective is to make sure that these conservation areas are integrated into the regional economies as assets, not as fiscal burdens. There is no doubt that tropical forests regulate not only regional but also global climate change. This was confirmed in a recent article published in Nature by Deborah Lawrence and Karen Vandekar. They did a meta-analysis of different models that analyze deforestation in tropical forests around the world. This study confirms that tropical deforestation results in warmer, drier conditions that may affect climate in general, but also agricultural production in particular. Tropical forests are the last frontier of development, and agriculture is the largest driver of climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental transformation. Only 60% of the food produced in the world is to feed people. 35% of the food is used to feed animals, and 5% is used for biofuels and other industrial uses. And we know that we need to produce about 70% more food to meet the demand of 9 billion people by 2050. Soy and beef are the most important crops in this equation. Soy is the most rapidly expanding crop in South America. And nearly 80% of the forest loss in the Amazon and the Cerrado resulted from the conversion to pasture for beef production in the past decade. In this context, markets can provide an important way to achieve a significant change on how food is produced. The objective is to change the behavior of producers so that they cultivate or ranch without further deforestation. But it will take a long time to do this if it is done farm by farm. We believe that it is easier to work with those companies that can send strong demand signals for deforestation-free products. If companies only demand deforestation-free products, then there won't be a market for food produced in other destructive ways. The world's food market is controlled by approximately 400 companies. The beef market in Brazil is controlled by only 4 meat packers. We propose a focus on deforestation-free supply chains of 2 significant commodities to test our assumptions, beef and soy. And we propose to focus on 3 strategies that will help us trigger the desired change: private sector commitments, traceability, and capital flows. First, let's look at the case of soy in the Amazon and the private sector commitments that resulted from a Greenpeace campaign. In 2006, Greenpeace published a very influential report that illustrated the different links in the soy supply chain. Greenpeace exposed the linkages between major buyers of soy and deforestation in the Amazon. And because of pressure of consumers, McDonald's and Walmart committed to buy soy only from deforestation-free sources. In turn, this put pressure on soy traders such as Cargill, Bunge, and ADM. Because the reputation of these companies were affected, profits had a hit. These companies were forced to negotiate with other soy traders, and this resulted in the establishment of the soy moratorium, a private sector supply chain agreement that was one of the first voluntary zero deforestation agreements in the world. The private sector commitment to have a soy moratorium was complemented by the efforts of the Brazilian government to cut funding to producers and municipalities engaged in deforestation activities. This encouraged producers to register their properties so that they could be taken out from the blacklist of producers and municipalities that had no access to funding. So, what happened many years later? The soy moratorium was first established in 2006, only for 2 years, but it has been renewed every year since then. It has recently been renewed until May of 2016. But last January, Holly Gibbs and Associates published an article in Science that provides a very important analysis that this approach has worked to avoid deforestation. So, first, the annual mapping of soy expansion that she analyzed shows that before the soy moratorium, about 30% of soy planted in the Amazon was directly replacing natural forests. But after the soy moratorium, this fell to 1%. So there's a significant change there. Second, the study illustrates that Brazilian government policies, like the Green Municipalities program or putting municipalities in the blacklist so they wouldn't have access to funding, are very good, but are not an adequate replacement for private sector commitments. Therefore, the moratorium needs to continue to be in place. And finally, and this is a very important finding, is that soy production could expand 600% in the Amazon biome under the moratorium restrictions. So it is not necessary to keep destroying the Amazon to produce soy. If you introduce this variable of scarcity, then it is possible to intensify production in areas that have already been opened. So the lesson here is we need to have policy, but it is not sufficient. Something similar with beef. Greenpeace did a similar report for beef in 2009, and their investigation exposed the linkages between deforestation and specific meat packers and retailers in the Amazon. This situation also forced meat packers and retailers to the table to negotiate a private sector commitment of sourcing beef from areas with no deforestation. At the Foundation, we are funding today a couple of pilot projects on beef in specific geographies in the Brazilian Amazon. One of them is in São Félix de Xingu in Pará, and you will see the video later today, Marianne, going back to São Félix. I have to tell you, I was very excited to visit after reading so much about it and hearing so much about it from Marianne. To visit São Félix de Xingu was an eye-opening experience. There are more cows than people there, by the way. So in this first pilot project, we are funding the Nature Conservancy, an NGO, that is working with Marfrig, the second largest meat packer in Brazil, and Walmart. The second pilot project that we're funding is in Alta Floresta in Mato Grosso, and there are links of University of Florida and Alta Floresta as well. I see Bob there. And we're funding Instituto Centro de Vida, a Brazilian NGO that is working with JBS, the largest meat packer in Brazil, and Carrefour. The objective is to test the idea that a strong demand signal for deforestation-free commodities by meat packers and retailers will trigger a change in the behavior of producers on the ground. So how do we know, or how are we going to know that all these measures are effective? It is important to monitor progress and results at different scales. For example, we need to know if these interventions are actually resulting in avoided deforestation. We are supporting Matt Hansen at the University of Maryland, who is working on analyzing deforestation around the world using satellite data. This effort is complemented by the work that the World Resources Institute is doing through its Global Forest Watch initiative to monitor global deforestation. Also, we need to know the progress in cleaning the supply chain from deforestation. Each company has its own way to track their product, but the idea is to make them accountable by tracking the products not only to the primary providers of the commodities, but also to the indirect providers in order to avoid laundering of the commodities. We are supporting TNC to work with Marfrig to develop a verifiable system that can trace the products back to the rancher. All this system is certainly fueled by capital. Because food is so important, there is a lot of money that has subsidized bad behavior among producers. What the soy and beef moratorium have done is to make corporations and producers accountable for their behavior. There has to be enough money in the system to provide the necessary positive economic incentives in every link of the chain. Economic initiatives in the form of credit and loans have been good carrots to encourage better behavior. Through the ABC program in Brazil, that is the low carbon agriculture program in Brazil, Banco do Brasil is providing loans for producers that want to intensify deforestation-free activities. In the international realm, IFC has provided a significant loan to Minerva, the third largest meat packer in Brazil, to expand its activities under the conditions of sourcing from deforestation-free areas. Also, there are new bilateral programs that are supporting this change. For example, IDH from the Netherlands established the Soy Fast Track Fund to support farmers that produce sustainable soy. Other initiatives, like the Bank Environment Initiative, is also targeting this type of financial institution. All of these cannot be done in a vacuum. New alliances are needed, particularly with the private sector. In this picture, for example, we see foundation representatives, an NGO, TNC, Marfrig, the second largest meat packer in Brazil, and Walmart, a retailer that is now committed to sourcing beef from deforestation-free areas. Walmart is certainly able to send strong demand signals that shakes the market. The development of protocols and standards through the roundtables of responsible soy and the roundtable of sustainable beef are providing the framework of this change. Corporations have pledged commitments through the Consumer Goods Forum. The idea is to have deforestation-free products by 2020, just in 4 or 5 years. The date is fast approaching, and there's a lot to be done until then. Another recent significant alliance is the one promoted by the US government after Rio+20, the Tropical Forest Alliance. All of these efforts gives me hope that the tide is turning and that we will be able to see a significant change in our generation. This change goes beyond corporate social responsibility. We must make sure that nature conservation is mainstreamed into regular corporate practices. Yesterday, when I was coming in the Delta flight to Gainesville, I opened the magazine, and there was an interview with the CEO of Cargill. And I went, oh, that's interesting. And one of the questions in the magazine said, and what do you think about deforestation in the tropics? And, he gave the answer. He said, well, we are committed to take out deforestation from our value chains, not only from beef and soy, but everything they do. And, it is really amazing to see that in this mainstream magazine. So things are changing. That gives me a lot of hope. So complementary approaches are key. Not one approach can do the job of conserving nature for the long term. There are risks, there are benefits. The risk of putting all the effort in protecting one biome, in this case the Amazon, may have displaced deforestation into other biomes, such as the Cerrado in Brazil and the Chaco in Argentina, Paraguay, and Bolivia. By using market-based approaches, we would be avoiding deforestation leakage into other areas. But for me, the most important risk is not doing anything. We need rapid change at a scale, and bold market solutions through the value chain may be able to provide a needed alternative. Now, in terms of benefits, we have, with a market approach, there could be a much broader reach, but there also are multiplication of benefits beyond specific places. Corporations that are engaged in this process work with many different commodities, and like the example of Cargill, they are expanding their deforestation-free commitments from soy and beef to other commodities, and also in other geographies that they operate. So the whole system needs to change, and the corporations have the ability to do this. So, in conclusion, protected areas and place-based approaches are excellent, but they are limited in scope. They will become more vulnerable if pressure is not removed. Market-based approaches are important. A focus on deforestation-free supply chains can provide a rapid solution at a scale. And finally, new alliances are necessary, particularly with the private sector. Yes, they were part of the problem in the first place, but they have to be part of the solution as well. It has been demonstrated that their reputation and their economic bottom line are at risk. So this is the opportunity to harness the power of the markets for the conservation of nature. Thank you.